The morning sun peeked through the clouds as David Turner stood in front of his closet, choosing his outfit carefully. As the newly appointed CEO of Skywings Airlines, he could have worn his usual expensive suit and tie. But today, he had different plans. He pulled out a simple gray hoodie, jeans, and comfortable sneakers. Today wasn't about looking important, it was about seeing the truth. David had spent 20 years working his way up from baggage handler to the corner office. He remembered those early days clearly, the long hours, the difficult customers, and most importantly, how passengers were treated differently based on their appearance. Now that he was in charge, he wanted to understand what really happened on his flights. "Time to see what my airline really looks like," he whispered to himself, zipping up his hoodie. At Chicago O'Hare Airport, David joined the long security line like any regular passenger. Nobody gave him a second glance. He wasn't the polished executive they saw in company newsletters. He was just another traveler heading to Los Angeles. As he approached the gate for Flight SW-892, David noticed how different the experience felt without his executive status. The gate agents barely looked up as they scanned his ticket. He had purposely booked a middle seat in economy class, seat 22B, the kind of seat most people try to avoid. Walking down the jet bridge, David felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. He hadn't flown economy in years, and he wanted to experience everything exactly as his regular customers did. No special treatment, no priority boarding, no recognition, just an honest look at his airline service. The cabin was already filling up as David made his way down the narrow aisle. He squeezed past other passengers stuffing bags into overhead bins and finally reached row 22. As he settled into his middle seat, he couldn't help but notice how tight the space was. "We need to look at these seat sizes," he made a mental note. His seatmates arrived shortly after, an elderly woman by the window and a college student with headphones in the aisle seat. They exchanged brief nods, the universal greeting of airplane neighbors who might spend the next 5 hours inches apart. David pulled out a small notebook from his backpack. He had always believed that the best leaders listened more than they talked. This flight was his chance to observe, to understand what his customers really experienced. He wanted to see how his crew handled problems, how they treated different passengers, and what could be improved. As more passengers boarded, David watched the flight attendants at work. They seemed efficient but rushed, going through their pre-flight duties with mechanical precision. He noticed small things, a smile here, a frown there, the way they spoke to different passengers. Every detail mattered when you were responsible for thousands of employees and millions of customers. David had deliberately chosen this flight because it represented a typical route in their network, not too long, not too short, with a mix of business and leisure travelers. He wanted to see how his airline performed on an ordinary day, not during special occasions when everyone was on their best behavior. Leaning back in his seat, David remembered his first day at Skywings Airlines 20 years ago. He had been so proud to wear the uniform, to be part of something bigger than himself. That young man could never have imagined he would one day lead the entire company. But with that leadership came responsibility. The responsibility to ensure every passenger, regardless of how they looked or where they sat, received the respect and service they deserved. As the cabin door closed and the flight attendants began their safety demonstration, David Turner, CEO of Skywings Airlines, sat quietly in seat 22B, looking like just another passenger heading to Los Angeles. He had no idea that this ordinary flight was about to become extraordinary, teaching lessons that would change his company forever. Little did he know that by choosing to fly incognito, he would uncover problems far deeper than tight seats and rushed service. This flight would reveal truths about his airline that no boardroom presentation or management report had ever shown. The aircraft hummed with the familiar sounds of a morning flight as passengers settled into their seats. Among the crew preparing for takeoff was Linda Foster, a senior flight attendant known throughout Skywings Airlines for running a tight ship. With 15 years of experience, she prided herself on maintaining order and following every rule to the letter. Linda began her pre-flight check, moving through the cabin with practiced efficiency. Her eyes scanned each row, ensuring overhead bins were properly closed and passengers were following safety protocols. That's when she first noticed the man in 22B, David, though she didn't know his name yet. Something about him caught her attention immediately. Maybe it was the casual hoodie and worn jeans, or perhaps the way he was scribbling notes in a small notebook. In Linda's mind, he didn't look like their typical business traveler. She felt a familiar twinge of suspicion, one she developed over years of dealing with difficult passengers. As she passed by row 22, Linda paused. "Sir, you'll need to stow that bag completely under the seat," she said, her tone sharp even though David's backpack was already properly stored. David looked up with a polite smile. "Of course, thank you," he replied, adjusting the bag slightly. Linda frowned. His politeness seemed to irritate her more. She'd seen his type before, or at least she thought she had. People who didn't belong in her orderly world of first-class businessmen and well-dressed travelers. Throughout the safety demonstration, Linda kept glancing at David. She noticed how he paid attention to every word, unlike many frequent flyers who usually ignored the instructions. But instead of appreciating his attentiveness, she grew more suspicious. Why was he so interested? What was he writing in that notebook? As the plane climbed to cruising altitude, Linda's colleague Tom prepared the beverage cart. "Starting with the front today?" he asked. "No," Linda replied firmly. "I want to keep an eye on 22B. Something's not right about him." Tom raised an eyebrow. "He seems fine to me. Just another passenger." But Linda had already made up her mind. She began the service from the back of the plane, positioning herself to watch David's every move. When she reached his row, she addressed the window and aisle passengers first, offering them drinks with her professional smile. Then she turned to David, and her demeanor changed completely. "And you?" she asked curtly, barely making eye contact. "May I have a water, please?" David responded pleasantly. Linda's jaw tightened. "We have a selection of beverages." "Are you sure that's all you want?" Her tone suggested he was being difficult by making such a simple request. "Yes, just water would be perfect, thank you." David maintained his friendly manner. As Linda poured the water, she noticed David's notebook again. Her suspicion grew. Who takes notes during a flight? In her experience, only troublemakers or people planning complaints did that. Throughout the service, Linda found reasons to pass by row 22 repeatedly. Each time, she observed David more closely. He wasn't watching movies or sleeping like normal passengers. He was alert, observing, occasionally jotting something down. To Linda, this confirmed her worst fears. When David asked for a second water later, Linda's response was deliberately slow. She made him wait while serving others first, hoping to discourage further requests. But David remained patient and polite, which somehow made her more agitated. Tom noticed his colleague's behavior and pulled her aside in the galley. "Linda, what's going on? You're treating that passenger differently." "There's something off about him," Linda insisted. "He's watching everything, writing things down. We need to be careful." Tom shook his head. "He's just sitting there quietly. Maybe he's nervous about flying." But Linda wouldn't listen. In her mind, she had already decided what kind of person David was based solely on his appearance and her own biases. She didn't realize that her years of experience had created blind spots, leading her to judge passengers unfairly. As the flight continued, tension built around seat 22B. Other passengers began noticing Linda's cold treatment of David. They exchanged glances, wondering what he had done to deserve such hostility. Little did anyone know that this mounting tension would soon explode into a confrontation that would change everything for Skywings Airlines. The flight was halfway to Los Angeles when the situation began to escalate. David had been quietly observing the service patterns, noting how different passengers received different levels of attention. He wasn't prepared for what happened next. The beverage cart came around again, and this time David decided to make a simple request. When Linda approached his row, he asked politely, "Excuse me, could I please have another water? I'm feeling a bit dehydrated." Linda's eyes narrowed. "You've already had water," she said, her voice loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "We have other passengers to serve." The elderly woman next to David shifted uncomfortably. She'd been watching the flight attendant's behavior and felt something wasn't right. "I don't mind waiting," she offered kindly. "Please give the young man his water." Linda's face flushed with irritation. She grabbed a water bottle and practically thrust it at David. "Here," she said curtly, trying to make it last this time. David remained calm, that he was beginning to understand the depth of the problem. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I appreciate your help." But Linda wasn't finished. She stood in the aisle, blocking David's view of the cabin. "What's with all the writing?" she demanded, pointing at his notebook. "Are you some kind of inspector? A mystery shopper?" Several passengers turned to look. David closed his notebook slowly. "I'm just making some personal notes," he explained. "Nothing to worry about." "Personal notes?" Linda's voice rose higher. "On a flight? That's suspicious behavior. What are you really doing?" Tom, her colleague, hurried over. "Linda, please," he whispered. "You're making a scene." But Linda was beyond listening. Months of stress, personal prejudices, and assumptions had built up to this moment. In her mind, David represented everything she distrusted about certain passengers. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification," Linda announced, her tone official. "Your behavior is concerning to the crew." David sighed inwardly. This was exactly the kind of situation he hoped to uncover, though he hadn't expected to experience it personally. "I'm happy to show you my ID," he said, reaching for his wallet. "But may I ask what behavior you find concerning?" "You're taking notes, asking too many questions, making special requests," Linda listed, her voice carrying through the cabin. "These are red flags for security." An older businessman across the aisle spoke up. "Miss, I've been taking notes too. It's for my work. Is that a problem?" Linda barely glanced at him. "That's different," she said dismissively. "How is it different?" the man pressed. Several other passengers were now paying attention, sensing the unfairness of the situation. Linda ignored the question and focused on David. "Your identification, please." David pulled out his wallet, considering his options. He could show his regular driver's license, or he could reveal his corporate ID. He decided to try once more to defuse the situation. "Before I show you my ID," David said calmly, "could we perhaps speak with your supervisor? I believe there's been a misunderstanding." His reasonable request seemed to trigger something in Linda. "Now you want to complain." "Typical," she exclaimed. "You people always want to speak to the manager when you don't get your way." The cabin fell silent. The words "you people" hung in the air like a dark cloud. Passengers exchanged shocked glances. Tom stepped forward, looking alarmed. "Linda, that's enough," Tom said firmly. "Let's handle this professionally." But Linda was too far gone. She'd convinced herself that David was a troublemaker and nothing would change her mind. "I don't need your help, Tom. I can handle this." David felt the weight of every eye in the cabin. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every passenger who had ever been judged unfairly, treated differently, or made to feel unwelcome. "Ma'am," David said, his voice steady but firm, "I've been nothing but polite. I'd followed every instruction. Yet you've treated me with suspicion and hostility from the moment you saw me. Why?" His direct question caught Linda off guard. For a moment, she seemed to realize how her behavior looked to others. But instead of backing down, she doubled down on her position. "Because something about you isn't right," she declared. "And I trust my instincts." The tension in the cabin had reached a boiling point. Passengers were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, watching the confrontation unfold. David knew he had to make a choice, continue playing the role of an ordinary passenger or reveal his true identity. "Here's my identification," David said, pulling out his wallet. He held up his corporate ID card, the one that clearly showed his position as CEO of Skywings Airlines. "Perhaps this will clear up any confusion." Linda snatched the card from his hand without looking at it properly. "Let me see this so-called identification," she said dismissively. She glanced at it briefly, then laughed. "Nice try. You expect me to believe you're the CEO? Please." She tossed the card back at David. It fluttered to the floor, landing face up in the aisle where several passengers could see it clearly. The businessman across the aisle leaned forward, his eyes widening as he read the card. "Wait a minute," he said, his voice shaking slightly. That's real. I've seen his picture in the company newsletter. This man really is David Turner, the CEO of Skywings." Linda rolled her eyes. "Oh, please, don't fall for this obvious fake ID. Our CEO wouldn't be sitting in economy class wearing a hoodie." David slowly bent down to retrieve his card. As he stood up, he noticed several passengers were now looking at their phones, apparently searching for his image online. One young woman gasped. "It's him," she whispered to her neighbor. "Look at this article from last month when he was appointed CEO." Word began spreading through the cabin like wildfire. But Linda remained unmoved, her prejudices blinding her to the truth right in front of her. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to stop disrupting the flight with these false claims," Linda said, her voice hard. "Please remain seated and stop bothering other passengers." David stood up slowly. "I'm not trying to disrupt anything. I'm simply asking for the same respect you show other passengers. Is that too much to request?" "Sit down immediately," Linda commanded, pointing at his seat. "I will sit down," David replied calmly, "but first, I'd like to understand why you've treated me differently from the moment you saw me. What about me made you suspicious?" His question hung in the air. Linda's face reddened with anger and embarrassment. Instead of answering, she reached out and grabbed David's arm. "I said sit down," she shouted. The physical contact shocked everyone. Tom rushed forward, but before he could intervene, Linda's frustration boiled over completely. As David tried to gently remove her hand from his arm, she raised her other hand and slapped him across the face. The sound echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. Everything stopped. Passengers gasped. Someone dropped their phone. The elderly woman next to David covered her mouth in horror. For a moment, no one moved. David stood there, his hand touching his cheek, more surprised than hurt. Linda's eyes went wide as she realized what she'd done. Her hand was still raised, frozen in the air. Tom grabbed Linda's arm and pulled her back. "What have you done?" he whispered, his face pale. Several passengers were now standing, their phones out, recording everything. The businessman across the aisle was already on his feet. "I'm calling the captain," he announced. "This is assault." "I witnessed everything." David remained remarkably composed. He took a deep breath and looked directly at Linda, who was now beginning to realize the magnitude of her mistake. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I think we need to have a serious conversation about what just happened here." Linda's bravado crumbled. Her hands began to shake as the reality of the situation sank in. She had just physically assaulted a passenger, not just any passenger, but possibly the CEO of the airline. Her career, her reputation, everything she'd worked for could be over in an instant. The cabin was in chaos. Passengers were talking excitedly, sharing what they'd witnessed. Some were demanding that Linda be removed from duty immediately. Others were checking their phones, confirming David's identity. Through it all, David stood calmly, knowing that this moment would define not just Linda's future, but potentially the culture of the entire airline. The cabin door to the cockpit opened, and Captain Robert Hayes stepped out, his face serious. The co-pilot had alerted him about a disturbance, but nothing had prepared him for the scene before him. Linda standing in the aisle, shaking, while passengers pointed and talked excitedly. "What's going on here?" Captain Hayes demanded, his authoritative voice cutting through the noise. Tom stepped forward quickly. "Captain, there's been an incident." "Linda," she struck a passenger. Captain Hayes' eyes widened in disbelief. "She did what?" As Tom began to explain, the captain's gaze fell on David, who was still standing calmly despite the red mark visible on his cheek. Something about the passenger seemed familiar, but in the chaos of the moment, he couldn't quite place it. "Sir, are you all right?" Captain Hayes asked, moving toward David. "I'm terribly sorry for." He stopped mid-sentence, his face going pale. "Mr. Turner," he whispered, suddenly recognizing the CEO he'd met at the company's annual meeting just weeks ago. David nodded slightly. "Hello, Captain Hayes. I didn't expect we'd meet again under these circumstances." The captain's professional composure cracked for a moment. "Sir, I had no idea you were on board. This is—" He turned to Linda, his expression a mixture of shock and anger. "Do you realize who this is?" Linda was trembling now, tears forming in her eyes. He's not really. It can't be." "This is David Turner, the CEO of Skywings Airlines," Captain Hayes announced, his voice carrying through the cabin. "The man you just assaulted is your employer." The words hit Linda like a physical blow. She staggered backward, grabbing a seat back for support. Her face had gone completely white. "No," she whispered. "No, that's impossible. He can't be." I didn't, I thought. David raised his hand to quiet the growing murmur among passengers. Everyone please, he said, his voice calm but commanding. Let's all take a breath. The cabin fell silent, all eyes on him. David straightened his hoodie and addressed the passengers directly. I want to apologize to all of you for this disruption, he began. I chose to fly incognito today to better understand our customer experience. What I've witnessed has been enlightening. He turned to face Linda, who looked like she might faint at any moment. Ms. Foster, isn't it? Linda nodded weakly, unable to speak. I've been watching you work, David continued. You're clearly experienced and dedicated to your job. But somewhere along the way, you've developed some dangerous assumptions about passengers based on their appearance. Tears were now streaming down Linda's face. Mr. Turner, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I never would have. That's exactly the problem, David interrupted gently. You shouldn't treat anyone this way, regardless of who they are. Every passenger deserves respect and professional service. The cabin remained pin-drop silent. Passengers were recording the exchange, knowing they were witnessing something extraordinary. The elderly woman next to David's seat dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Captain Hayes stepped forward. Mr. Turner, what would you like us to do? We can divert the flight, have security meet us. David shook his head. That won't be necessary, Captain. We'll continue to Los Angeles as planned. But I would like to have a private conversation with Ms. Foster and the crew once we've landed. He looked around at the passengers. I also want to thank those of you who spoke up when you saw something wrong happening. That takes courage. The businessman who had first recognized David cleared his throat. Mr. Turner, if I may say something, what you're doing right now, handling this with such grace, it shows real leadership. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the cabin. David smiled slightly, then turned back to Linda, who was still crying silently. Ms. Foster, this is a teachable moment, he said. Not just for you, but for our entire company. The question is, what are we going to learn from it? Linda looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, struggling to comprehend how the man she had treated so poorly could respond with such dignity. In that moment, she began to understand the true measure of leadership and the depth of her own prejudices. The rest of the flight to Los Angeles felt surreal. Linda had been relieved of her duties and sat quietly in the crew area, occasionally wiping away tears. Tom and the other flight attendants took over, serving passengers with extra care and attention, aware that their every move was being watched. David returned to his seat, politely declining offers of first-class upgrades from the embarrassed crew. I started this journey in 22B, he said with a small smile, and that's where I'll finish it. As the plane began its descent into Lex, David stood up and asked Captain Hayes for the intercom. The captain handed it over without hesitation. Ladies and gentlemen, this is David Turner speaking. His voice came through the speakers. I want to address what happened today. What you witnessed was not just about one flight attendant's actions, but about a deeper issue that exists in our society and apparently within our company. Passengers put away their phones and magazines, giving him their full attention. I've learned that sometimes our biases can blind us to the humanity in others, David continued. Today, I experienced firsthand what some of you might face regularly, being judged not by your character or actions, but by appearance alone. He paused, letting his words sink in. As your CEO, I promise you this, Skywings Airlines will do better. We will learn from this incident and make real changes. The cabin burst into spontaneous applause. David handed back the intercom and returned to his seat. The elderly woman next to him patted his arm gently. You handled that beautifully, she whispered. When the plane landed, David asked the crew to remain behind. Passengers filed out, many stopping to shake his hand or express their support. Some even apologized for not speaking up sooner. Once the cabin was empty, David gathered the crew in the first-class section. Linda sat apart from the others, her head down, hands clasped tightly in her lap. I want everyone to understand something, David began. What happened today isn't just about punishment, it's about growth and change. He turned to Linda. Miss Foster, would you please join us? Linda stood slowly, her legs shaking. She walked over and stood before David, unable to meet his eyes. Look at me, please, David said gently. Linda raised her head, tears still fresh on her cheeks. "Mr. Turner, I'm so ashamed. I don't know what came over me. I didn't think I was prejudiced," David offered. "Sometimes we don't recognize our own biases until they're shown to us in stark relief." Linda nodded miserably. "I've destroyed my career, haven't I? 15 years, gone because of my own stupidity." David was quiet for a moment. "That depends on what you do next. I could fire you. That would be the easy solution. But I believe in second chances, especially when someone shows genuine remorse and willingness to change." The crew exchanged surprised glances. Linda's head shot up, hope flickering in her eyes. "Here's what's going to happen," David continued. "You'll be suspended for 3 months, during which time you'll undergo intensive diversity and sensitivity training. You'll also work with our HR department to develop a new training program for all flight attendants using your experience as a teaching tool." You're not firing me," Linda whispered. "No, I'm giving you an opportunity to turn your worst mistake into something positive for our entire company," David replied. "But understand this, it won't be easy. You'll have to face what you did, examine your prejudices, and work hard to change not just your behavior, but your mindset." Linda's tears flowed freely now, but they were tears of gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Turner. I won't let you down. I promise I'll do whatever it takes." David nodded, then addressed the entire crew. "This incident will not be hidden or covered up. We'll use it as a catalyst for change throughout Skywings Airlines. Every employee, from baggage handlers to board members, will undergo bias training. We're going to create an airline where every passenger feels welcomed and respected, regardless of how they look or what they wear." The crew nodded solemnly, understanding they were witnessing a pivotal moment in the company's history. 6 months had passed since that fateful flight from Chicago to Los Angeles. The incident had made headlines across the aviation industry, but not for the reasons anyone expected. Instead of scandal and lawsuits, it became a story of transformation and hope. Linda Foster sat nervously in the conference room at Skywings headquarters, adjusting her newly designed uniform, one that now included a special pin recognizing her as a diversity champion. She was about to present the company's new training program to a group of airline executives from around the world. David Turner entered the room and smiled warmly at her. "Ready for your presentation, Linda?" She nodded, still amazed at how much had changed. "Thanks to you, Mr. Turner. I never imagined I'd be here doing this." "You earned this opportunity," David replied. "Your honesty about your own biases has helped thousands of our employees recognize and address theirs." The training program Linda had helped develop was revolutionary. It didn't just lecture people about diversity, it used real experiences, including her own story, to show how unconscious bias could affect anyone. The program had been so successful that other airlines were now asking to implement it. As Linda began her presentation, she spoke candidly about that day on Flight SW892. "I thought I was a good person," she told the audience. "I never considered myself prejudiced, but I had developed blind spots over the years, making assumptions about passengers based on their appearance." She clicked to the next slide, showing a photo of David in his hoodie from that day. "When I saw Mr. Turner dressed casually, sitting in economy class, my biases took over. I treated him differently, and it escalated to a point I never thought I was capable of reaching." The room was silent as she continued. "That slap wasn't just a moment of lost control, it was the physical manifestation of years of unchecked prejudice. And it took that shocking moment for me to finally see myself clearly." David watched proudly as Linda explained how the incident had sparked company-wide changes. Skywings had implemented an anonymous feedback system where passengers could report discriminatory treatment. They'd started a mystery passenger program where executives regularly flew incognito to experience real customer service. Most importantly, they'd made diversity and inclusion a core part of their business strategy. "The results speak for themselves," Linda said, showing a graph. "Customer satisfaction has increased by 35%, especially among minority passengers. Employee morale is at an all-time high, and our profits have grown because people want to fly with an airline that treats everyone with respect." After the presentation, as the executives mingled over coffee, David pulled Linda aside. "You know what," he said, When I decided not to fire you that day, some people thought I was being too soft. They wanted me to make an example of you. Linda nodded. I wouldn't have blamed you if you had. But I saw something in your reaction, genuine remorse and a willingness to change. That's rare, Linda, and look what you've accomplished since then. Linda's eyes welled up. You gave me a second chance when I least deserved it. I'll spend the rest of my career making sure no passenger ever feels the way I made you feel. Later that year, at the aviation industry's annual award ceremony, Skywings Airlines received the prestigious Airline of the Year award. As David accepted the trophy, he invited Linda to join him on stage. This award belongs to every employee who is willing to look in the mirror and challenge their own biases, David announced. Sometimes our greatest failures can become our most powerful teachers if we're brave enough to learn from them. The audience gave them a standing ovation. In that moment, Linda realized that the worst day of her life had led to the best chapter of her career. She had gone from being the face of prejudice to becoming a champion for change. As the applause continued, David turned to Linda and said quietly, "You know, that flight to Los Angeles? It turned out to be the most important journey of both our lives." Linda smiled through her tears. "It certainly changed our destination, didn't it?" And indeed it had, not just for them, but for an entire airline industry that was learning the true meaning of respect, dignity, and second chances.